So we're going to be talking about GitOps and how we use Terraform Enterprise and Sentinel to unlock cloud, through GitOps as our journey. And a little bit about me, the DevOps architect in Australia. We were lucky enough to be the first production implementation of Terraform Enterprise in the ASX 50. And I've got an identical twin, and he'll appreciate being on record as the smarter twin. So let's just get right into it. So why is cloud so hard? A question that comes up a lot, and I think that this Dilbert comment sums it up really well, is that people tend to focus a lot on the technology aspect. So this interaction between an architect and an executive talks about, why didn't cloud solve all of our problems straight away? And really, the executive response is another technology option. Just put it in containers, and then when that doesn't work, Kubernetes. If we, it hurts how close to home that hits. And if we really break down, what the majority of the main challenges that are faced in this, we look at the change in the service model from a traditional IT service model to a cloud native IT self-service model. And we'll have a look at that in the next slide. And then we look at the culture change and impacts that have happened and what's needed to move from one offering to another, and how a company likes to operate in those environments. And then, of course, speed, risk, and cost come into it. The cloud can be in a remarkably fast-paced environment, but that speed can get you in trouble if you're not paying very careful attention to the risk and cost aspects of that. And we'll cover a little bit of that in the responsibility model a little bit later. But how do we solve these issues? Well, we turn to GitOps, and my definition of GitOps is using Git as the source of truth for the management and deployments of cloud native technologies. And why I say my definition is because WeWorks, who originally coined the term, specifically coined it to manage the deployment and application deployment of Kubernetes clusters and applications. And so I think that now, with the tools that we have available to us, we're able to broaden our horizons with that and look to manage all of the cloud as we go. So GitOps, we spoke about that transition from traditional IT to cloud native IT, and what role GitOps plays in that environment. And in a traditional IT world, where we're looking at ITIL as our system of management, where people are managing systems, there's very clear roles of who's responsible for what. We have oral tradition, very spoken tradition. John looks after that service, Mohammed looks after this, and it's very clear who is responsible for what. But when we try and move that system of management to cloud, we end up getting a lot of process friction. And it's when we try to run those monolithic processes in a loosely coupled way for cloud native technology, that process friction really comes through and causes a lot of issues for us. When we're in the traditional world, there's one data center or maybe two for DR, but that's kind of all we have, and it's very hard to change and costly, and it's very risk adverse. Whereas when we're in the cloud, we want to be much more free and open to innovate and have a lot more scalable capability. So how do we look at achieving that? Well, excuse me. So at AGL, this internal open source, or inner source, as it was coined by Tim O'Reilly in 2000, is kind of what we turn to. And what inner source means is that we use open source software development best practice internally within our own organization to establish an open source like culture. And when we talk about HashiCorp products, that's kind of at the core of their belief. And one of the links I've got here is actually from Armin Dadgar, who's one of the co-founders with Mitchell, who spoke earlier, and now the co-CTO as well, talking about a typical journey from ITIL to DevOps. And he uses this term of decentralizing the trunk of enterprise technology. I really recommend that video, but what I took away from it the most was, we have this trunk where we want to have the main core capabilities, and we want to enable development teams, platform teams, DevOps teams, whatever we call them, to contribute to that centralized capability and then build up on top of that themselves. And when they're building up on top of that, we're hoping that they end up building these green applications or leaves that kind of mean we're not reinventing and fighting for money and food and water, as that helps that tree grow and that business prosper. And how we achieve that is by this inner source culture. And the more we use it, the more we start to reap rewards around reusability, flexibility, faster time to market, and importantly, better employee motivation. And I'm lucky enough to have been in a team where it is very community driven and everyone's really keen on collaborating on infrastructure as code and networking and other bits and pieces, there are a lot of pull requests that come, but they turn into kind of an audit engine, and we know who changed what and why did that happen, and we can kind of use that to base, all of our bits and pieces off. So how do we kind of visualize that transition? So, whether you want to call this an operating model or a responsibility model, when I put this visualization together, it was really to illustrate just how much change is needed in that journey from an ITIL-based traditional IT data center approach to a cloud native one, and how a lot of enterprises today actually find ourselves somewhere in the middle in this hybrid IT world. And what happens is, as you can see in this traditional IT world over here, as I was saying, there's an app team that looks after apps, a middleware team that looks after middleware, data, and this infrastructure team. And everyone's very clear on what they do. And it typically happens in this on-premise environment. And if I was looking to build an application in this, like a payments microservice or something we were just talking about before in console, I would have to go and request a network address space from the network team, and then go and request a server from the infrastructure team, and then go and request a middleware if that was needed for my app, and then production data access, then maybe manually load my application into the infrastructure, or maybe we do have a CI/CD pipeline, who knows? So all of these steps add so much time to the process I have to go through. And when we start to move into this hybrid IT world, things are a lot more confusing. We have this DevOps team that's attempting to run everything end to end, and we still have these other teams potentially that are trying to hold on to their domains. And this gives huge overlaps of capability, huge grabs for territory and battles for control. And it's almost impossible to know who to speak to for what. And it's not an ideal scenario, but if you do learn who to go to, it can be faster. And a lot of companies have seen that reward. But what's the cost of that? Is there an increased risk, increased complexity that comes with that as we move towards more of this cloud-based solution? Now, the goal is to get to this cloud-native IT world where we have GitOps as our driver and our answer to solving these problems. And in this, everyone has the same shared responsibilities as we start to leverage more services such as containers as a service like Kubernetes, and serverless functions like Lambda or functions in Azure. So at AGL, how did we look to use this? Well, we look towards Terraform Enterprise as our abstraction away from this. And very quickly, Terraform Enterprise is the enterprise offering of the open source software of Terraform, which I'm assuming everyone knows. And it has over 200 providers, from everything from our main public cloud providers like Azure, AWS, GCP, but also GitHub and New Relic, and even Domino's Pizza. And some of the dev advocates have made an awesome presentation on trying to order a pizza through Terraform, which is pretty cool to go and look at. But to really cover off why we looked at Terraform Enterprise, if we break down what we get out of Terraform, we get these modular and reusable pieces of code, which really helps speed up how we approach building and developing software and infrastructure. And it's easy to introduce into our teams because it's extremely human readable, and we don't need to spend lots of time training people on how to use these services that we've built. And my favorite part about Terraform is extendability. So how we can use any of those 200 providers or make our own providers on top of what's there originally to extend things. So maybe I want to enable a developer to build a Azure subscription, but then also deploy an Azure DevOps project and pipeline with a secure connection. And I can do that all from singly using Terraform. Now, Terraform Enterprise is really where we start to think about the scale of enterprise and how do we address those problems. And for me, the collaborative infrastructure of code experience where we all have workspaces with RBAC separating everything is really key. And then looking at how we can use Sentinel to take care of our compliance aspects and enforce tagging and other bits and pieces we'll cover a little bit later. And then also the security aspect. So, single sign-on is hugely important of data, using the Vault backend, for example, in Terraform Enterprise and audit logging. And then the scale side of it, we run loads of concurrent jobs. In the middle of the day could be up to, a couple, 150 to 100 concurrent jobs. And being able to control that through our custom worker images that we manage is really important. And then also looking at the new clustering data that's there gives us a lot of flexibility. So that's really, really quickly the difference, from our added benefits of Terraform Enterprise. And we had to focus on how we look at working with these tools and technology. And one of the biggest premises that we have is abstraction. So how do we enable teams to operate on ideas rather than individual events. So if we wanted a developer to deploy a full application, how would we go about doing that? Well, that might be 40 or 50 different steps to get to production. How do we make that as simple as possible so they don't need to know every intricate little step that's required to actually deploy that application and that infrastructure? And so to really unlock that full value of cloud, we realized we needed more than just this operations team here looking at the private module registry. And we needed everyone to get on board. And that's really where that inner source mentality and culture helped to try to uplift how we worked as a company. And we couldn't just open the doors and let everyone start to raise pull requests to our modules, because we didn't want security to be trying to lock down apps so that developers couldn't work. And we didn't want developers to be trying to open to the world. We needed some kind of way to control these things. And so something like this, which is a bit hard to read, I apologize, but I made something called this zone model where we look to break down the resources that we have in Azure to specific security boundaries. And if we look at the coloring that's here, it's very similar to what we had on that responsibility model, where we have security and networks, cloud ops, and the application teams. And they all kind of want to own little bits and pieces of the kind of the landscape that we have across Azure. And my favorite example of this is subnets. We've got a subnet, an application subnet here, where we have the network team that care about what address range that's in. We have the application team that care about how that's talking between their app and data subnets. And we have the security team that care whether or not that's publicly facing or poses a risk to how that operates. And so how do we enable those teams to work together? And again, it's GitOps that's the answer for that, and how we leverage Terraform Enterprise with its VCS providers to enable us to do that. And so if we looked at that example of a developer wanting to write a piece of code, here we have a developer who just wants to push things into production and test and dev environments into Azure. He wants to run a container application. And this is not all of it, but these are all pieces that he needs to be successful for a production enterprise application. We need to have a GitHub repo, a subscription in a management group, tags across our resource groups and networks and container registries and Azure DevOps project and billing information. And so rather than have this developer have to look after all of that themselves, we have all of these teams that are able to collaborate together on these individual modules and hide a lot of that complexity away from that developer and end user. So how does that actually look as code, right? That's the interesting part. So when we had a new developer onboarded, as a developer, I need a GitHub repository to store my application code. Well, how can I do that? Well, we have a central repository and Terraform workspace that looks after GitHub repositories. And all they need to do is raise this new 5-6 lines of code that deploys a module that has the complete encapsulation of what we define as an enterprise-ready GitHub repository. And that will deploy that for them by them just providing our repository name, which is obviously a new money-making product that we're going to make millions of, and what the description of that is, and which team in GitHub needs access to that. And so by doing that in one pull request, they're enabled to start writing their code straight away and adding value to the business on day one. When we look at then how a dev or an engineer needs to deploy new application infrastructure, again, we want to make sure that they're deploying into a specific workspace for their application, and they're using the modules that we have that have all of our controls that are ticked off by security, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. So here they're adding a name and location, a resource group, and these are a bit simplified to fit on the screen, but essentially that will build them everything that they need to be able to deploy that application code into a web application in this instance. I did a speech on a user group on Terraform at Scale that covers a lot more detail about this. So if you want to check out some more about that, it's listed down there. The last one though that no one ever talks about is networks as code. And it's one of those that DevOps never really want to touch. But again, we have a module for that. And if we look here, there's a source module, a specific version. We have our information here, our resource group name, where do we want it, the size of the address, the name of the network, and whether we want it connected on the express route. What's amazing about this module, nowhere have I asked you to give me an IP address range. So we actually in our module point to an IPAM solution that can actually call the next IP available range of that size that you want, in this case a /28, and then automatically using some of the inbuilt Terraform functions, split that into 3 even subnets called web app and data. And so you're able to really fast track how that works for the developers. And the benefits we start to get of that is previously we had all of these concerns on the developer who just wanted to develop and deploy their application. So infrastructure, costs, security, operational concerns, how the network worked, risk compliance. And all they really want to do is be efficient and add value to the business. And so what we want to do is, and what we have done is use Terraform Enterprise as kind of that central hub where that capability is now available for them to just develop and then deploy. And we have parties helping to contribute to this massive shared internally facing open source community on how we best do cloud native technologies at AGL, which is super exciting. And we start to get these benefits of governance and compliance, cost visibility, increased developer productivity. And as a result of this program we ran, we actually bought our data center exit 2 years ahead of schedule, which is a massive money saver for us. And so the one thing we haven't spoken about so far is like the security role in all of this, and how do we make sure that we're managing the security aspects of this from within Terraform Enterprise. And that's where Sentinel really enters the equation. So it's itself, but it's a feature of HashiCorp stack, and it's a policy as code framework, and it works on any of the enterprise offerings and in Terraform Cloud of Console Enterprise, Nomad Enterprise, Terraform Enterprise, and Vault Enterprise. And what it really is for us, it's a point of control between the defined and the real state. And and we can use that for things like security controls, tagging, as I mentioned earlier, and even identity management. And so one of the examples that I've got here is how we use Sentinel for tag validation in Azure. And so for those that don't know, tagging in Azure is absolutely critical for reporting. So we can use it, and other organizations use it for ensuring tags on cost code and ownership and application names, even CMDB IDs if we're forced to. And people always ask, why don't we just put those modules? Well, if we started to hard code those in the modules, the day that we have to raise a pull request across our 400, 200, whatever, how many modules we have, that's a lot of pull requests with the same change. And we want to really leverage that one-to-many mentality. And so by having Sentinel scan every Azure resource that can have a tag, and make sure that it has these values from a single point of control, we're able to manage and trace across all of our workspaces from Terraform Enterprise if those resources have met our requirements from a compliance point of view for tagging. And then we can also validate that within Azure policy itself. So we have the ability to manage that defined state and then the observed state on the deployment side. And one of the reasons we pushed this out of Azure was because of some issues we faced with deny rules and scale out issues that we faced in Azure. If we tried to scale a virtual machine and there was a deny rule for tags, sometimes that machine wouldn't build because it didn't inherit the tags correctly. So that was obviously an issue we wanted to correct. So what else do we use Sentinel for? So we use Sentinel for an enablement piece. So when we have some rare instances where we want developers or engineers to deploy things that would be classified as a privileged change or resource, we don't want to just give them the access to do that. We want to take a least privileged approach. So things like creating an Azure subscription, peering a VNet to the hub, creating or adding an Azure AD group to another resource group they manage. We can use Sentinel to whitelist specific modules that we have that only perform those actions, and therefore enable teams to become self-sufficient and manage that entire workspace and blast radius themselves. And so that's really the glue that enables us to go from this kind of hybrid IT world to everyone working cohesively together. That least privilege approach, and using Sentinel as kind of our distraction and like our governance between that, is a really, really useful feature that we would have been stuck without, and was kind of a bonus to us when we started to try to look at using it. There's also new things like budgeting that's become available in Sentinel as well, or cost estimations it's called, that we're looking at using, that we can't wait when we can use enterprise price books for that. And that's kind of how Terraform Enterprise and Sentinel have like enabled us to use GitOps in a way that unlocks the value of the cloud. And I know we're not taking questions today, but I'd like to thank the sponsors and HashiCorp for throwing on this event at such short notice from the change of the Hashi Days event that was in Sydney. If you have questions that I can't get to in the Q&A, hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. I've written a couple of articles on Medium, and be more than happy to answer any questions you've got. So thanks very much for listening.